All right, so picking up where we left off, we're sort of going through our little hit list of follow-ups for WordPress installations. And where we left off was we got to the place where we're going to delete some tables, and then I'll show you how to restore them based off of the last database backup we made. Okay, so before I do anything, I want to double check, and this is really important. I always double check and make sure that I really do have that SQL file, and this is the one right here, and it doesn't have a file association, and I showed you if you just double click it in mine, it automatically opened up Edge code, and here if I do it this way, I can also do it by choosing specifically and telling it to go to like something like text edit, and it, will show it to me like that. It's not as pretty as the color-coded stuff, but whatever. And I already confirmed that it did in fact have the stuff that I was expecting it to have. And if you wanted to double check, you can look at the tables that it's creating, and then you can look at the first one, and you could look at all of them if you really wanted to, and then all the way down to the bottom. If we scroll to the bottom, you could also look at the last one that it creates. So it goes all the way down to P2 users, and you see in fact that P2 users is the last one that's in my installation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my student 25 database, and I'm going to choose to check all of these just to show you how confident I am. I'm going to check all of these, and then where it says with selected, I'm going to hit drop. So I'm going to drop all of those tables, and what I need to do is hit go, and it's going to, oh, I don't know why it did that. Anyway, but it's going to give me this warning. Do you really want to drop all of these? Okay, let me tell you, when you drop something out of a database, it cannot be undone. The only way it can be undone is if you have a backup of the query that is required to recreate that table. So just be aware that when you drop something from a database in MySQL, it is really gone. So I'm going to hit yes. And okay, well, it's taking just a second. Okay, so there it goes. It dropped everything, and now it shows me having 0 tables again. So if I blow this up a little bit, you can see here I have 0 tables. Okay, well, not to worry. Well, and also I should say that this is the thing that would happen if I were to go to my installation of WordPress. Let's do that real fast. Let's go into a new window here, and we're going to go to student 025, and then if I go to project 2, it's taking me to the installation page. It's because it sees that in the config file there's no valid database. You might also, if you have an older version, you might get a database connection error. So the problem is that I don't have any tables that are properly configured for this particular installation. Remember, my WP config file is pointing to use specific information within that database, and it's not there now. So what I can do here is I'll go back, and I'm going to go now to the import. Well, first I'm going to make sure I'm choosing my student 25, go to import, and I'm going to choose the file to import, and it was in my downloads, and it's the SQL file right here. And then I leave all the rest of these settings okay to the same way that they're set already, and hit go. And it just refreshed it for me, and it said that my queries were successful, and it reinstalled my table again. So, and for some reason, just, I paused it so that you wouldn't have to wait for it, but it actually took a little bit longer than I was expecting it to, maybe almost a minute to import that file. So occasionally the server might be a little bit slow, but you typically can look down at the bottom left or somewhere at the bottom and see the status of what's going on the website. So now if I go back to that WordPress installation, let's go back and get rid of that, and let's try to just go to project 2 again, and let's see what happens. And in fact, it went ahead and it loaded the base installation, and this is what the basic WordPress installation looks like for 2014 theme. So yeah, so my backup worked. It was successful, and that's how you do that part of it. Okay, so now that you know how to back up your files and your database and restore, on the class server or in the cloud, then what you also might wonder is like where your localhost database stored. So if you're developing locally and you want to back those files up because you still want to back your stuff up, one of the things that you need to remember is that your files are actually stored in your XAMPP folder, or if you're using MAMP, they're stored in your MAMP folder, which is in your applications file folder. So this is important because if you ever reformat your computer or you get a new one, it's really easy to forget about transferring those files because maybe they're not in your documents or on your desktop or pictures or whatever. Without those, your localhost sites are useless. Like, without those databases, they're useless, but also, just so you know, that's also where your websites are stored too, for the files. Both the files and the databases are stored within that main XAMPP folder. So how do you transfer them? Well, to transfer localhost databases without doing a dump, like I just showed you via phpMyAdmin, and yeah, it's a terrible name to do a dump, but that's really what it's called, is dumping your files or dumping your records. So to do that without doing a dump, you must stop the MySQL service on your computer. And to safely back up files and databases, you should stop Apache and the MySQL services. Then you can safely copy the entire XAMPP or MAMP folder to another location. And I'm not going to show you where those are located because you should already know where those files are located. Okay, so another thing is you might assume that each WordPress installation, each set of files is always going to have its own database. Well, that's not necessarily true. If you only have one database to work with, like on our class server, you can still install multiple WordPress site installations, because think about it, we are going to have 2 WordPress projects in this class, and both of them have to be turned in on my server. Whether or not you have your own hosting or you have it on your local host, you still have to have a functional version up on my server. Okay, so how would you do that? Well, you would need a separate freshly downloaded WordPress folder loaded into your web folder. And when I say separate, I mean separate from if you already have an existing installation, like in this example that we've been talking about, we have this Project 2 WordPress folder. Well, if I wanted another WordPress installation, I would put another WordPress folder up in my root level web directory and call it whatever I wanted. So now I've got 2 separate WordPress folders. Okay, and then the second thing is during the installation, you use all the same credentials for connecting to the database. So like student 025 for the user, student 025 for the database, and so forth, except that you will create a new table prefix. And remember, in my example before, I used p2 underscore. Well, maybe for the third project, you could use p3 underscore. So each WordPress installation will look only at its designated tables with its special prefix. Okay, why would I do this? Well, it's only if you have access to a single database. You would not want to do this for any other reason. Otherwise it's inefficient, because if you think about it, whenever you have multiple instances of WordPress looking in the same database, every single hit that it gets on these different sites are going to be querying the same database, so it's going to eat up the resources every time for that database. So if you have the ability to do multiple databases, then you should have one database per WordPress installation. It's just the most efficient way. Okay, and the other thing too is, you might wonder, well, can I separate those tables out later? Yes, you can. You can selectively dump the tables into separate SQL backup files in order to restore them later to separate databases. And it's not hard at all. And if you remember, if you even want to go backwards, there was a place where I showed you how you could select the specific tables that you wanted to dump. Well, you don't have to select them all like I did in the last example. You could just select the ones that all have the same prefix, and then you dump those. Okay, users. I'm so confused about all the users and what they access. This is really typical, and it's really normal for you to be confused about this when you're first exposed to it. it's hard to understand sometimes how to distinguish which username you're supposed to be using and when, and like how they work. So let's just sort of like try to keep it simple. These are the user accounts that you need to keep track of. All right, you have FTP user, you have a database user, and you have WordPress users. Now let's look at how those things are defined. Okay, so the FTP user. This user has direct access to the file system and can upload WordPress and other files via FTP clients like FileZilla, CyberDuck, Fugu, Putty, SFTP, that kind of stuff. All right, then there's the database user. This user is granted specific privileges by the MySQL service, okay, by the service, to manipulate specific databases. And this is the one that people a lot of times will confuse with the next one, which is WordPress users. Database user and WordPress users, not the same things. Okay, so the database user is the one that I'm going to be giving you access to, like through Blackboard and through the XLS spreadsheet that you can download from Blackboard. All right, that user specifically has access to use the database. WordPress users, however, are users that are stored within the WordPress database's WP users table, or whatever the prefix is that you're using. In our case, it would be like the P2 users or the P3 users maybe, if you specified your prefix like that. Okay, special permissions are granted based on the user's role so that they can use or manipulate that particular WordPress database. So this isn't something, it's something that is still technically managed, I guess, by MySQL, because the database is managed by MySQL, but really it's the instructions within the WordPress installation within that file system that tells the database, I guess it tells the database what it's going to query, so what it's asking for, but the actual files in the WordPress installation have the sets of instructions about, what different types of users are able to do. So like you have administrators, those are going to be like the sort of the super users who can do anything to the WordPress website. And then you're going to have other people like editors, and you're going to have people like subscribers, who can't really do anything, but they can read, they can't actually make changes. So WordPress users literally are stored within the WordPress database's table called WP users. It's not something that MySQL specifically has a special user name for, okay? This is something that WordPress manages itself. Don't worry if that's a little bit confusing right now. What's going to be helpful is later, as you start to understand a little bit more about how this stuff works, you can always come back to this and refer back to it, and it'll make more sense once you start using the tools. Okay, this is something else that sometimes can happen when you have problems with migration. Again, this is something that you don't necessarily have to know right this minute, but I'm bringing it up right now because when it comes up later, you can always come back and look at this demo or this lecture to see if you can get some tips on troubleshooting. So when you start doing things like migrating WordPress installations from one server to another, you might end up seeing like the quick installation walkthrough screen when you're not expecting it, like as if it thinks there's not a database connected to it. Don't be alarmed. It's likely that your config file needs to be modified to suit its new environment. So like if you went from one server called something.com and now you're trying to put it on another server called somethingelse.com, then you might just need to go and modify something about the config file, because maybe the somethingelse.com server, it's got a new database name, a new database username, new password, or whatever. So this is really common. It's a common oversight that people make when they're migrating. If the database and its tables are all intact, this is likely the issue.